Hey, it's Max McAllister from Traction Dynamics. Had a couple questions asked that needed more clarification on our 2001 to 2017 Honda GoldWing front fork removal and installation video. And there's some questions as pertain to the front axle and some things that I could clarify to help people understand that. So the question was posed, what about space? If I see space between the wheel spacers, is there a problem? So normally on any motorcycle, any space between any wheel spacers is a problem because that would allow the wheel to float on the axle. What's kind of what's confusing until you study it on the Honda GoldWing and many other modern motorcycles are assembled the same way, is that only one side of the axle is actually tightened against one fork leg. The other fork leg floats on the axle during assembly until the pinch bolts are tightened. So I showed the process of aligning the left fork leg on the Honda GoldWing. So what you don't see is, I don't have all the parts here, but I can explain it if you come down closer. So this is a Honda GoldWing front end. There's a wheel spacer on each side of the wheel, and so what happens is the axle, when you tighten the axle nut, is pulled through the fork assembly, and the right wheel spacer is drawn against the right wheel bearing. There's a spacer inside of between the two wheel bearings so you don't bind the wheel bearings. Left wheel bearing, left wheel spacer, and then the axle. What you don't see at first glance is the head of the axle here. The head of the axle is actually like the head of a bolt. It is being tightened against all of those things in that stack and is pulling them all across to the right fork leg. So as you tighten your axle nut, spacer touches bearing spacer, touches bearing, touches wheel spacer, touches axle head. That's all pulled tight and torqued. Then, to align the two forks so that they're perfectly parallel, this fork is able to float on the head of this axle. So there is no lip here, and this can move as necessary to be aligned perfectly. So that's how that works and how that assembles. So then the question is posed, and this is a common thing, and don't be embarrassed, but people think that their motorcycle will pull one way or the other due to one fork or one of the other sides being misaligned properly or leaking. So it's not uncommon for people to come here and say, my right fork leaks, and now when I turn right, my bike doesn't handle right. So unfortunately, that's just in your imagination. So even though there are two forks on the bike, collectively the entire assembly is called the fork. That's kind of where you get the, like a dinner fork slang term from. So they're joined at the top by the triple clamps, and the axle goes through the bottom. So you can kind of picture them in your mind more as a U. So the top half is one U with two tubes pointing down. When you put the axle through the legs and tighten the pinch bolts, that's another U. And the two U's are moving with each other, right? So if one fork leaks, it's joined to the other fork. So they don't function independently. If one is, not working optimally, it's not going to make your bike handle poorly in one direction and not the other. The only time you'll have assembly errors cause the bike to want to pull one way or the other, and that's if the front end were to be assembled with some form of twist in it, which is kind of hard to do. So if your bike were to be pulling one way or another, and there was no damage to any components that's known of any way, like you've never crashed the bike, it's never anything like that, then a simple procedure would be to start at the steering head, making sure the steering head's torqued properly, the bearings are, with the crown nut loose, torque, have to take the crown off, torque the steering bearings, replace the steering crown, Both fork tubes should slide up freely in and out of the triple clamps. If they don't, that's a sign there's a problem. But as long as the top nut isn't torqued, then the two triple clamps are free to line up squarely. And when you push both tubes up into the forks, they should slide freely before you torque them. Then torque the entire assembly down. The axle should pass through freely. After that, if your bike still pulls to one side of the road or the other, there's some simple but harder to believe things to look for. And one of them is just a heavily loaded saddlebag will cause your bike to pull one way or the other. So not uncommon for people to have a very substantial toolkit in their GoldWing. You know, it might weigh 25 pounds or more, depending on what you take on the road with you. So having a heavy load in one saddlebag will actually make your bike pull to one side or the other. So if you have a pulling issue, take everything out of your bike, go back down a road where you thought your bike pull, and try that there. People talk about crown on the road. Some people say it's a myth, some people say it's real. If you have any doubt and your bike pulls one way down a road, you know, find an empty road. You're obviously not going to do this in downtown major metro city, but if you're going down some country lane, you know, and you feel like your bike pulls one way, turn around and go backwards in the same lane, obviously with no oncoming traffic. I have to make the disclaimer. Ha ha ha. But if your bike, and see if it behaves the same way, that way you can eliminate the road as the source of the pull. If your bike still wants to pull, you know, then you've got some sort of other issue going on. So if you eliminate all those things, you got a more complex problem, and there you'll have to get a Honda or a company like ours, or another company or two that can do frame measuring and alignment. You may have some sort of actual issue with your frame. Highly unlikely, tiniest amount of possibility that that's actually the case. It's normally just assembly errors, so that would cause that, or overloading in some strange way. So anyway, hopefully that clears up some of those questions that were posed about the front end assembly and then bike behavior afterwards. So thanks a lot.